think you have to be extremely careful when you're reporting on the environment that you are looking at the source of the information. For example, with carbon capture and storage, it's clearly something we are going to have to do, but it's also being heavily pushed by the oil industry because they see it as a way of mitigating the continued extraction of oil. If you can bury the carbon from it as you're burning it, then what's the harm, they would argue. But of course, we need to move away from fossil fuel. All the evidence shows that, and yet still capture carbon and bury it. We need to get to negative emissions. So you need to be very careful. And I think it does get increasingly complicated to get to the truth. You double source everything clearly, and try and go to an independent academic for somebody who can referee some of these very complicated arguments that are coming from both sides. And sometimes the scientists and the environmentalists don't agree. For example, there's a spectrum to the green campaigners. Some would argue that we need to stop. Extinction Rebellion, for example, would argue that we need to stop producing carbon as soon as 2025, whereas the IPCC, which produces the reports for the United Nations, and we will hear an awful lot more about that at COP26 in Glasgow, they would argue that it is possible to slowly taper off the carbon emissions over a greater time span. So it's about keeping well connected with the science, I think. When you're having to disrupt economies and convince people to undergo quite significant change to the way they lead their lives, that it needs to be heavily evidence-based.
What are some of the other pressing issues that you perhaps feel we're not taking and not focusing on as much as we should, particularly when it comes to environmental reporting?
I think it's that the just transition is going to be one of the major hurdles that we're going to have to overcome. I'm old enough to remember when Margaret Thatcher suddenly decided that we were going to shut down the coal pits and start burning gas instead. Now, back then it was seen as an ideological thing. There were whole communities that depended on the money that came from men, and it was men back then, who worked down the pits. It wasn't just the families; it was the whole community. And without the pit, communities died. And you can imagine the heart being ripped out of some of these towns in the northeast, the Yorkshire, South Wales, and so on. The extraordinary, the agony for families, not knowing how they were going to survive. That social structure had gone. There is a danger we go through that all over again. With the oil industry, they're going to have to transition towards a greener world. And you're already seeing that in places like Grimsby, where traditionally it has been fish. Now, there's just no, compared to how it was 30, 40 years ago, there are many, many fewer fish in the North Sea. It's harder to make money, and that the young people are now not sure whether to keep one foot in the past and continue with the fishing that their family's been doing for generations, or make the leap and go into wind farms. That's where the money is at the moment, but it's something that it's an alien world for them. And even within one seaside town, you've got these two economies, the one that's the old and the dying versus the new booming economy of wind. It is really interesting, and I think it's going to be very difficult to manage it properly.
This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and I think we need people like Greta to say blah, 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 because they're the ones that are really holding the policymakers to account. She gets an awful lot of airtime, and it is very difficult for the adults, if you like, to tell her that she's wrong, because she clearly has a huge following, and that the younger generation do feel that those in power now are ignoring a really important issue that is only going to get more important as the decades go by, because climate change will really wreak havoc, in 50 years' time if we don't cut carbon. So I think, having covered both the Paris and the Katowice climate summits, it at first hand it looks like a talking shop, but it is really important. What was designed at Paris was hugely important, and it set in train everything that has followed. All the discussions now about going net zero by 2050 is because of Paris. What we need to do with this conference is to hear action, not just targets, and we will hear an awful lot of commitments in the run-up to COP about trying to reduce the amount of coal that is going to be burnt, and so on. But we need to see that actually action, some clear milestones that can be that policymakers can be held accountable over. There will be, I suppose, four main issues that we will hear from COP26, and they are coal, cars, cash, and trees. That's the mantra of the conference. We want to, they want to seek clear commitments to phase out coal power stations, because it is the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. They want to make a transition away from petrol and diesel to electric cars as swiftly as possible. Cash is about making sure that low-income countries have the financial support to offset, to live with some of these changes. Low-lying islands, which are going to be literally flooded in the next 20, 30 years, well, they need either the means to hold back the flood or even move to a different country, possibly New Zealand or Australia, for example, if they're in the South Pacific. And trees is all about planting masses of trees, tens of thousands of acres of trees, because that's the only way you're going to be able to absorb the greenhouse gases fast enough.
The incredible resources that go into public relations to feed journalists news. How on earth do you cope with that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're right. You get an awful lot of information from a variety of sources. You learn which ones are the trustworthy ones, the ones where you really need to use your judgment over. I mean, it doesn't mean that the oil industry hasn't got a point. You can't exclude the fact that they are hugely important to the UK economy, and I suppose that is one of the tensions. There is an element of climate hypocrisy, I suppose you could say, both on the part of the UK and indeed Norway. Both countries have professed to be making the transition to a net zero world while still extracting large amounts of oil and gas from the North Sea. And it doesn't appear on our balance card, because that's not the way the global accounting system works. It appears on somebody else's debit, because they're the ones who are actually burning it. We just take the money.
How important is it to gather evidence and to actually go out on the hustings where possible to do these sort of reports that you do?
Massive on both counts. It is so important that you are properly looking at all the evidence, the spectrum of the evidence, and there is there are lots of different viewpoints on climate. At Sky, we don't balance up the old arguments that we did 20 years ago, when you had somebody saying that climate change was real and a danger and a threat, we needed to reduce carbon. You'd always balance that up with somebody who's saying it was fake news, it just wasn't real, that we could keep burning the fossil fuels without fear. That argument's moved on. The referee has decided that's a foul. So now the decision is over how quickly we need to make the transition. So yes, absolutely, make sure that you understand the evidence, but then get out there and ground truth it, because sometimes you find the story is more complicated, more nuanced, that it might be a better story than you'd first set out to pursue by actually speaking to people on the ground, and you realize that there's something much bigger going on. There have been a number of instances through my career when this has been an issue, and climate change is a big one. The MMR vaccine was a huge one, because I used to be a health correspondent, and that was very divisive. You had parents who were very quick to present their children to the camera. You know, this is, my child has autism, it is because of the MMR vaccine. And not only was that, you know, their testimony, but it was also, you had that emotional reaction to, here was a sick child, well, it must be bad pharma or whatever that has done this. And then on the other side, you had the doctors, you know, you would have them saying, you know, that there's just no evidence. And then there was this Andrew Wakefield, who is the person, the doctor who started the ball rolling. He's now been struck off by the General Medical Council, and he's practicing over in America. He's not allowed to practice in the UK anymore. But all that was very, very complicated. And so you had the two sides, that Andrew Wakefield and then the NHS doctors who disagreed, and then you had the parents. And of course, by having a parent there, because you want the human interest, any story has human interest, and the obvious human interest was somebody with a sick child. Well, that changes the story from the word go, right? Because we've shown this sick child. It communicates with people at a much deeper level. You have to be aware of that, whatever you're reporting on, and it's very true of the environment too.